The bus wheezed to a stop with the sound of tired brakes, a lonely sigh in the damp Oregon air. Jack Reacher stepped off, the sole passenger to disembark at the town of Redwood Creek. He owned nothing but the clothes on his back and a foldable toothbrush in his pocket. He needed nothing more. The plan was simple. Coffee, maybe some breakfast, and then he'd walk, heading east with no destination in mind. Destinations were a complication. Redwood Creek looked like a postcard painted by someone with a limited palette. Muted greens of the surrounding forest bled into the gray of the overcast sky and the weathered wood of the storefronts. It was clean, too clean. The sidewalks were swept, the windows gleamed, and there was a conspicuous absence of the usual small-town detritus. It felt less lived in and more curated, like a movie set waiting for the actors to arrive. Reacher's internal alarm, a finely tuned instrument honed by years of military policing and a life of constant observation, gave a low, almost imperceptible hum. He found a diner, the Creekside Cafe, with a neon sign that flickered weakly against the morning gloom. Inside, the smell of stale coffee and bacon grease was a welcome, authentic scent in the otherwise sterile town. He took a seat at the counter. A handful of locals were scattered at the tables, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously. Another data point for Reacher's internal file on this town. People in diners were supposed to be loud, complaining about the government or gossiping about their neighbors. This felt like a library. A young woman with tired eyes and a tremor in her hand approached him, notepad at the ready. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Please," Reacher said. "Black." She poured it, her hand shaking so much that a small amount sloshed over the rim of the thick ceramic mug. She wiped it hastily with a rag. "Anything else?" "I'll look at the menu." She slid one in front of him and turned to leave, but as she did, her fingers brushed his hand. It was a deliberate, fleeting touch. When she pulled away, a small, tightly folded napkin was left in his palm. Reacher didn't react. He didn't look down. He simply closed his hand around it, his gaze fixed on the menu, his senses on high alert. He could feel the waitress's fear like a static charge in the air. He could also feel the eyes of two men in a booth by the window, thick-necked guys in matching gray jackets, who weren't eating, just watching. He ordered pancakes, ate them slowly, and drank 3 cups of coffee. The men in the gray jackets paid and left, climbing into a black sedan parked across the street. They didn't drive away. They waited. Reacher paid his bill in cash, left a generous tip for the terrified waitress, and walked out into the damp air. He didn't look at the black car. He turned left and walked toward the edge of town. Once he was out of sight, sheltered by the first of the giant redwoods that gave the town its name, he unfolded the napkin. The writing was a panicked scrawl, the pen having pressed hard into the cheap paper. It said just 2 words: Old Mill. Reacher had no reason to get involved. His code was simple: mind your own business. But the woman's terror had been genuine, and the 2 men in the car were not local loggers. They were professionals. Trouble had found him, as it so often did. And Reacher had another, more fundamental rule. You don't walk away from a plea for help, especially one that came with watchers. The old mill wasn't hard to find. A derelict husk of a building, it stood by a rushing creek slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The air was thick with the smell of wet, decaying wood. Reacher approached with caution, circling the perimeter, his eyes scanning for tripwires, lookout points, anything out of the ordinary. He found fresh tire tracks deep in the mud, leading to a loading bay at the rear of the building. They matched the tread he'd noticed on the black sedan. He slipped inside through a broken window, his large frame moving with a silence that defied his size. The interior was a cavern of shadows and rotting machinery. A single smell cut through the dampness: copper. The sharp metallic tang of blood. He followed it to a small office at the back. The door was ajar. Inside, a man was slumped over a desk. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with a press badge on a lanyard around his neck. His face was pale, his eyes wide and vacant. A single neat hole in his forehead told the story: an execution, On the desk, next to the man's hand, was a laptop, its screen smashed. Reacher checked for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find. Rigor mortis was setting in. He'd been dead for a few hours. Reacher scanned the room. It was a professional cleanup. No shell casing, no fingerprints he could see. But professionals made mistakes when they were in a hurry. He checked the victim's pockets. Empty. Wallet, keys, phone, all gone. But tucked into the man's sock, Reacher's fingers found a small metal object, a USB flash drive. He pocketed it. He heard the crunch of gravel outside. 2 cars this time, pulling up fast. He didn't need to see them to know who they were, the town's welcoming committee. He moved back into the main part of the mill, melting into the deep shadows behind a colossal, rust-eaten saw blade. The door burst open. Sheriff Brody entered, flanked by 2 deputies. Brody was a big man, trying to project an aura of authority, but his eyes were shifty. He saw the body in the office. "Well, look at that," Brody said, his voice a little too calm. "Looks like we found our missing journalist." One of the deputies, a young kid who looked barely out of his teens, swallowed hard. "Sheriff, should we call it in?" "In a minute," Brody said, his eyes scanning the mill. "Check the area. Our anonymous tip said there was a vagrant hanging around here." Reacher remained perfectly still. The anonymous tip. They hadn't just known about the body. They'd been ready to pin it on the first available stranger. Him. This was a setup, neat and tidy. Brody's men started moving through the mill, their flashlights cutting uselessly through the gloom. They were sloppy. Reacher could have taken them both out in seconds, but he needed to know how deep this went. He waited for his moment. The 2 deputies split up. The younger one approached Reacher's position. The kid was nervous, holding his flashlight in one hand and his gun in the other, a classic mistake. Reacher let him get close, so close he could smell the cheap aftershave the kid was wearing. When the deputy turned his head, Reacher moved. He stepped out of the shadow, a silent giant. He didn't use a weapon. He used his hand, a single precise chop to the side of the kid's neck. The deputy crumpled without a sound, his flashlight rolling across the floor. "Harris?" the other deputy called out. No answer. Reacher was already moving, using the massive machinery as cover. The second deputy, a beefier man with a handlebar mustache, began walking cautiously toward his partner's last position. Reacher came at him from the side, a palm heel strike to the nose, followed by an elbow to the temple. The man went down like a sack of cement. Now it was just the sheriff. Brody stood at the office door, his gun drawn. "I know you're in here," he called out, his voice betraying a sliver of fear. "Come on out. We can talk about this." Reacher didn't talk to crooked cops. He circled around, using the noise of the creek outside to cover his footsteps. He emerged behind Brody. The sheriff must have sensed him. A change in the air, a presence at his back. He started to turn. He wasn't fast enough. Reacher disarmed him with a swift, brutal twist of the wrist that sent the gun clattering to the floor and would leave Brody's hand numb for a week. He spun the sheriff around and slammed him against the wall. "Who was the journalist?" Reacher's voice was low and flat. Brody gasped, pain shooting up his arm. "I don't know what you're talking about." Reacher increased the pressure. "You were waiting for me. You and the 2 guys in the sedan. Who are they?" "Security," Brody grunted, "for Aegis Dynamics." "And what is Aegis Dynamics?" "They're the town's biggest employer," Brody said, sweat beading on his forehead. "They run this town. Now let me go." "You're going to let me walk out of here," Reacher said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You're going to tell your men in the sedan that you searched the place and found nothing but the body. You're going to say the killer must have left hours ago. If you don't, I will break your arm in 3 places, and then I'll walk out of here anyway. Do you understand?" Brody, his face pale with pain and fear, nodded quickly. "I understand." Reacher shoved him away. He picked up the younger deputy's sidearm, checked the magazine, and tucked it into his waistband at the small of his back. He gave Brody one last look, a look that promised a world of pain if he was crossed, and then he slipped out the back of the mill and disappeared into the dense, forgiving forest. He needed to find the waitress. She was the only lead he had. and he needed to know what was on the flash drive that was worth killing for. Finding her wasn't difficult. He remembered the name tag on her uniform. Sarah. He also remembered the way she'd glanced out the window toward a small cluster of houses on the other side of the creek. People who work early shifts often live close by. He found her house, a small, neat bungalow with a neglected garden. He didn't knock. He circled to the back and found a window slightly ajar. He listened. He heard quiet sobbing from inside. He slipped through the window into a small kitchen. Sarah was at the table, her head in her hands. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide with terror, a small gasp escaping her lips. "Don't scream," Reacher said softly. "I'm the man from the diner. I went to the mill." The terror in her eyes was replaced by a wave of grief. "David," she whispered. "My brother, is he?" Reacher nodded slowly. "I'm sorry. I found him." She broke down completely, her body shaking with sobs. Reacher stood there, an awkward, silent sentinel. He was no good at comfort. He was good at finding facts and delivering consequences. He waited until her sobs subsided into ragged breaths. "Who did it?" she asked, her voice thick with anguish. "The people who run this town," Reacher replied. "Aegis Dynamics. Your brother was a journalist. What was he investigating?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Aegis came here 2 years ago. They promised jobs, prosperity. They built a huge research facility just outside of town. At first it was great, but then things started to get strange. People became quiet, paranoid. My brother, David, he thought they were using the town as a testing ground for some new technology. Surveillance tech. He said they were listening to everything, watching everyone. He said he had proof." "I think I have it," Reacher said, placing the USB drive on the table. Sarah stared at it. "That's it. That's what he was working on. He said it was encrypted, but that he had the key." Before she could say more, the sound of a car engine cut through the quiet street. The same black sedan Reacher had seen outside the diner. It pulled up in front of the house. "They know," Sarah breathed, her face draining of color. "They followed you." "No," Reacher said, his eyes fixed on the car. "They followed you. They were watching you in the diner. They saw you give me the note." 2 men got out of the car, not the 2 from the diner. These men were bigger, and they moved with the cold, efficient economy of trained soldiers. They were not here to talk. "Get in the back room," Reacher ordered. "Stay away from the windows and don't make a sound." Sarah scrambled from her chair and fled down the hallway. Reacher didn't look for a hiding place. He stood in the center of the living room, a large, immovable object, and waited. The front door splintered inwards, kicked off its hinges. The first man came through, low and fast, a suppressed pistol in his hand. Reacher had already anticipated his entry point. He grabbed a heavy floor lamp and swung it like a baseball bat. The metal base connected with the man's head with a sickening crunch. He went down and didn't move. The second man was smarter. He didn't rush in. He used the doorway for cover, peering around the edge. Reacher picked up the sofa and hurled it towards the door, a feat of strength that seemed impossible. The sofa crashed into the wall, blocking the entrance and forcing the second man to retreat onto the porch. Reacher went out the back door, circling the house in seconds. The man was focused on the blocked front entrance, trying to figure out his next move. Reacher came up behind him. "Looking for me?" The man spun around, trying to bring his weapon to bear, but Reacher was already inside his guard. A quick series of blows, a jab to the throat, a knee to the solar plexus, a hammer fist to the base of the skull. The fight was over in less than 5 seconds. Reacher took the man's weapon and dragged both unconscious bodies inside, out of sight. He found Sarah huddled in a closet. "We have to go," he said. "Now." "Where can we go?" she cried. "They own the whole town." "We're not staying in town," Reacher said. He looked at the USB drive still on the table. "We need a computer, and we need the key to decrypt this." "The key," Sarah said, her mind racing. "David told me if anything happened to him, the key was our first secret." Reacher looked at her. "What does that mean?" When we were kids, we built a treehouse deep in the woods, by the old quarry. It was our secret place. Our first secret. That was the password he used for everything. The woods were their only chance. Reacher took some supplies from the kitchen, a loaf of bread, a bottle of water, a knife. He found a map of the county in a drawer. The quarry was 5 miles away, through dense forest. It would be difficult terrain, but it was better than waiting for more of Aegis's men to arrive. "Let's go," he said. "They'll be sending more people. We need to move." They slipped out the back and into the twilight embrace of the redwoods. The forest was their sanctuary and their prison. Behind them, Redwood Creek was a town held captive by secrets and technology. Ahead of them lay a flash drive that held the truth. And all around them, the hunters were gathering. Reacher knew this was no longer about just helping a waitress. He had been drawn into a war, and his code was clear. You finish what you start. The trek to the quarry was grueling. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of roots and slick pine needles. Sarah struggled to keep up, her city shoes useless in the wilderness. Reacher moved with an unnerving ease, his senses alive to every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves. He was in his element here. He carried the pack with their meager supplies and practically pulled Sarah along, his grip on her arm firm and reassuring. They stopped only once, when they heard the distant thrum of a helicopter. Reacher pulled Sarah under the dense canopy of a low-hanging fir tree, covering them with fallen branches. They lay still, listening as the helicopter circled overhead, its searchlight cutting stark, white beams through the darkening woods. It was a military-grade machine. Aegis Dynamics had serious resources. After a few minutes, it moved on. "They won't find us on foot at night," Reacher said, his voice a low rumble. "Not in these woods, but they'll be waiting on the roads. We stay off the grid." They finally reached the quarry just after midnight. It was a massive, man-made crater, its stone walls dropping sharply to a dark, still pool of water below. On the far edge, perched precariously near the cliff, was the dilapidated skeleton of a treehouse, just as Sarah had described. "David's laptop should still be up there," she whispered. "He kept an old one, off the network, for his private work." Getting to it was the next challenge. The treehouse was 20 feet up a massive oak, the original rope ladder having rotted away years ago. For Reacher, it was a simple problem of physics. He found a fallen log, braced it against the trunk, and scaled it with an agility that belied his size. He checked the treehouse. It was empty and dusty, but in a loose floorboard, wrapped in an oilcloth, was an old, heavy laptop. He lowered it down to Sarah before dropping silently to the ground beside her. They found a sheltered alcove in the rock face hidden from view. The laptop whirred to life, its battery mercifully holding a charge. Reacher inserted the USB drive. A password prompt appeared on the screen. "Our first secret," Sarah typed, her fingers trembling slightly. The screen flashed, and then a single folder appeared. It was filled with files. Audio recordings, video clips, internal Aegis documents. They clicked on the first video file. The face of Marcus Thorne, the charismatic billionaire CEO of Aegis Dynamics, filled the screen. He was speaking to a group of men in a boardroom. The video was grainy, clearly filmed by a hidden camera. "Project Nightingale is not just a surveillance system," Thorne was saying, his voice smooth and persuasive. "It's a behavioral prediction engine. By analyzing the ambient audio and network traffic of an entire population, we can predict dissent, identify potential threats, and neutralize them before they even act. Redwood Creek is our proof of concept. The residents are our lab rats. Once we prove its efficacy here, we will sell it to the highest bidder. Governments, corporations, whoever wants to ensure absolute control." Reacher and Sarah watched in horror as they went through the files. David had gathered everything. Recordings of townsfolk's private conversations, documents detailing illegal wiretaps, and a master list of potential dissidents in the town, people who had asked too many questions or refused to work for Aegis. Most of them were now listed as having moved away. "He had it all," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "This is why they killed him." "This is bigger than just this town," Reacher said, his face grim. This technology in the wrong hands. He didn't need to finish the sentence. They found the most damning file last. It was a detailed sales agreement, a beta contract between Aegis and a rogue intelligence agency in a hostile foreign nation. The deal was set to be finalized in 2 days. The data upload from the Redwood Creek servers was the final step of the transaction. "We have to get this out," Sarah said, her voice finding a new strength. "We have to show the world what they're doing." "The world is a long way away," Reacher said. "Right now, we just need to get through the night." As if on cue, they heard the sound of engines. Not a helicopter this time, but ATVs, their engines whining as they navigated the rough terrain. A team of Aegis security, led by their head of security, a man named Cade, whom Reacher had seen in one of the files. He was the one who had led the assault team on David. "They found the house," Reacher said. "They knew you had a brother. They figured out where you'd go." He looked at the laptop. "Copy the most important files back onto the drive. The Thorn video and the sales contract. Leave the laptop. It'll slow us down." While Sarah worked, Reacher scanned their surroundings. The quarry was a death trap, one way in, one way out. Except, he looked down at the dark water. "Can you swim?" he asked Sarah. She nodded. "Yes." "Good," he said, "because we're going for a swim." The ATV headlights appeared at the edge of the quarry. Men in tactical gear fanned out, sweeping the area with high-powered flashlights. Reacher grabbed Sarah's hand. "When I say go, we run for the edge and jump. Don't hesitate. Aim for the center. It'll be deepest there. The shock of the cold water will be bad, but you have to kick for the surface." He could see Cade directing his men, his movements sharp and professional. This was a man who knew his business. "Go!" Reacher yelled. They sprinted from the alcove, a desperate mad dash across 20 yards of open ground. A shout went up from the security team. The flashlights pinned them. A shot rang out, then another, the bullets zinging past them and chipping stone from the cliff edge. They reached the precipice and didn't stop. They launched themselves into the black void. The fall seemed to last forever. Then the icy water hit Reacher like a physical blow, stealing his breath and driving him deep. He fought against the shock, his training kicking in. He kicked hard, his powerful legs propelling him upwards towards the faint shimmer of moonlight on the surface. He broke through, gasping, and immediately looked for Sarah. She surfaced a few feet away, sputtering and panicked. "Swim," Reacher commanded, his voice a harsh whisper. "For the far side. Stay quiet." They swam through the frigid water, their bodies going numb. More shots were fired, but the darkness and their low profile in the water made them impossible targets. They reached the other side, hauling themselves out onto the muddy bank, shivering uncontrollably. They were alive, but they were soaked, freezing, and still hunted. Reacher knew they couldn't stop. He pulled Sarah to her feet and they plunged back into the woods, leaving the quarry and the laptop behind. Cade's men would find the laptop and assume the evidence was destroyed. It might buy them some time. They walked all night, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and their pursuers. As dawn broke, they stumbled upon a deserted logging road. Reacher knew it was a risk, but they couldn't stay in the woods forever. They were exhausted and Sarah was on the verge of hypothermia. A few minutes later, an old pickup truck rattled down the road, driven by an elderly farmer. Reacher flagged him down. He used the $20 bill he had left and a story about their car breaking down miles back. The farmer, a kind-faced man with suspicious eyes, hesitated, but the sight of the shivering Sarah made up his mind. He agreed to take them to the next town, a place called Silver Creek, about 30 miles away. As they sat in the back of the truck, hidden under a tarp, Reacher held the small flash drive in his hand. It felt impossibly heavy. They had the proof, but they were fugitives. Thorn and Cade would not give up. They would assume Reacher and Sarah had survived the jump. They would be hunting them with every resource at their command. Getting this information to the authorities was not going to be easy, especially when they didn't know which authorities they could trust. Reacher looked at Sarah, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep. She had put her trust in him, a complete stranger. He had his own code, a simple set of rules he lived by, And now, that code demanded he see this through to the end. He had to tear down Marcus Thorne's empire of secrets, not just for David, not just for Sarah, but for everyone. Because if a man like Thorne could turn one small town into a prison, he wouldn't stop there. Reacher closed his hand around the flash drive. The fight was far from over. It was just beginning. In the small town of Silver Creek, Reacher found them a cheap motel room. He paid cash. He told Sarah to get a hot shower and rest. While she did, he went to a nearby hardware store. He bought a roll of duct tape, a set of cheap screwdrivers, a can of lighter fluid, and a box of Strike Anywhere matches. Then he went to a thrift store and bought 2 sets of bland, forgettable clothes, a few sizes too big for both of them. Their old clothes were a liability. When he got back, Sarah was sitting on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a threadbare towel. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice still shaky. "The plan is to stop them," Reacher said. "Not just expose them, stop them. The data upload is happening tomorrow. If that data gets sent, it doesn't matter what's on this drive. The technology will be in the wild. We have to stop that upload. That means going back." Sarah stared at him. "Going back? To Redwood Creek? They'll be everywhere." "They'll be looking for 2 people running away," Reacher explained. "They won't be looking for 2 people walking straight back into the fire. We go back. We get into the Aegis facility, and we destroy their servers. Everything. How can we possibly get into a place like that?" "The same way you get into any fortress," Reacher said, laying out his purchases on the cheap motel bed. "You find the weakness, and every fortress has one." He spent the next hour online, using the motel's slow Wi-Fi on Sarah's phone. He wasn't looking for schematics or guard schedules. He was looking for a different kind of weakness. He found it in an online forum for local contractors. A catering company had recently lost its contract with Aegis Dynamics over a health code violation. Another company, Silver Creek Catering, had just won the contract. Their first delivery was scheduled for tomorrow morning. The plan was simple, and therefore dangerous. They spent the night modifying their new clothes. Reacher drove them in a stolen car, a beat-up sedan he'd hot-wired from a back alley, to an all-night diner 20 miles out of town. They waited. At 5 a.m., the Silver Creek catering van pulled into the parking lot. The driver, a portly man in his 50s, went inside for coffee. Reacher approached the van. The lock was cheap. He had it open in 10 seconds. He and Sarah climbed into the back among the trays of pastries and insulated coffee containers. It was cramped and smelled of cinnamon. A few minutes later, the driver returned, and the van rumbled to life. They were on their way back to Redwood Creek. The journey was tense. Every police car they passed made Sarah jump. Reacher remained calm, listening to the sounds of the road, preparing himself for what was to come. As they approached the gates of the Aegis facility, the van slowed. Reacher could hear the driver exchanging pleasantries with a guard. A moment later, the van was moving again. They were inside. The van parked at a loading dock behind the main building. They listened as the driver got out and started unloading. When he was gone, Reacher pushed the back door open a crack. The loading dock was empty. "Now," he whispered. They slipped out of the van and flattened themselves against the wall of the building. Reacher pointed to a ventilation shaft cover about 10 feet up the wall. "That's our way in," he said. He laced his fingers together, creating a foothold. Up you go. Sarah, small and nimble, scrambled up his hands onto his shoulders and managed to pry the cover loose. She disappeared inside. Reacher then jumped, catching the ledge of the opening with his fingertips and pulling his entire body up and into the shaft. The ventilation system was a dark metallic maze. They crawled on their hands and knees, following the main trunk line, the sound of their movements masked by the hum of the building's HVAC system. Reacher had studied the facility's general layout. The server room had to be in the core of the building, heavily reinforced and cooled. They followed the coldest air. They found a grate that looked down into a pristine white hallway. 2 guards stood outside a large metal door labeled Data Center. "The server room," Sarah whispered. We wait for a shift change, Reacher said. They waited for nearly an hour. Finally, 2 new guards arrived to relieve the first pair. In the brief moment of distraction, as the guards exchanged pleasantries, Reacher made his move. He kicked the grate out. It crashed to the floor below. Before the guards could react, Reacher dropped down, landing in a crouch. He moved like lightning. The first guard turned, his hand going for his sidearm. Reacher was already on him, a brutal elbow strike crushing the man's throat. He collapsed, gagging. The second guard managed to draw his weapon, but Reacher grabbed his arm, twisted it, and used the man's own momentum to slam him headfirst into the metal door. The other 2 guards were just turning around, shock on their faces. Reacher disarmed one and used him as a shield as the other raised his rifle. It didn't matter. Reacher closed the distance in 2 strides and the fight was over before it began. 4 men down in under 30 seconds. Sarah dropped down from the vent. "The door is on a maglock," she said, pointing at the keypad. "I can't bypass it." "Don't have to," Reacher said. He dragged one of the unconscious guards over to the keypad and pressed the man's hand against the scanner. The lock clicked open. The server room was cold and loud, filled with rows upon rows of humming black towers. A large monitor on the wall showed the progress of a data transfer. "Global upload 87% complete. We're running out of time," Sarah said, rushing to a terminal. "I can try to wipe them, but it will take too long." "Forget wiping them," Reacher said. "We destroy them, physically." He looked around the room. On the wall was a fire suppression system control panel, halon gas, lethal in high concentrations, but effective. More importantly, the system had a failsafe. In case of a catastrophic fire, a series of explosive bolts would sever the power lines and data cables to prevent an electrical surge. "Get back in the vent," Reacher ordered. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to create a catastrophic fire," he said, pulling out the can of lighter fluid and the matches. Suddenly, the door to the server room hissed open. Cade stood there, a pistol in his hand. Behind him were 6 more heavily armed men. "Reacher," Cade said with a cold smile. "I knew you were too stubborn to just run. Drop it." Reacher didn't drop the can. He looked at Cade, then at the servers, then back at Cade. "It's over," Cade said. "The upload is almost finished. You've lost." "You think so?" Reacher said. In that moment, an alarm began to blare throughout the facility. Red lights flashed. On the monitor, a new message appeared. "Warning, external network breach detected, initiating security lockdown. Sarah." Before climbing into the vent, she'd plugged the flash drive into the terminal and initiated a virus, a simple but aggressive worm that David had designed. It wouldn't stop the upload, but it would trigger every alarm in the system. It was the distraction he needed. Cade's men looked around, momentarily confused. That was all the time Reacher required. He threw the can of lighter fluid at the main server bank. It burst open, dousing the hot electronics. Then he struck a match and tossed it. The servers erupted in a ball of chemical fire. The heat was instantaneous and intense. "Fire in the data center!" one of the guards yelled. Cade, his face a mask of fury, raised his pistol to shoot Reacher, but Reacher was already moving, using the rows of servers as cover. The guards opened fire, their bullets ripping through the metal towers, creating a shower of sparks. The fire suppression system kicked in. A deafening klaxon sounded. "Warning! Halon release imminent! Evacuate area!" "Get him!" Cade screamed, but his men were already backing away from the fire and the threat of the gas. Reacher didn't run for the door. He ran deeper into the inferno. He could hear the explosive bolts counting down with a series of loud clicks. 5, 4, 3. He vaulted over a burning server rack just as Cade came around the other side. The 2 men met in the heart of the fire. Cade was fast and skilled, a flurry of kicks and punches. Reacher was a wall of granite. He took the blows, weathering the storm, and gave back punishment that was pure brute force. A right cross from Cade snapped Reacher's head back. Reacher answered with a headbutt that broke Cade's nose. They grappled, surrounded by flames, the air growing thin. 2, 1. A series of loud bangs like gunshots echoed through the room as the explosive bolts fired. The power died instantly. The humming of the servers, the lights, the monitor on the wall, everything went black and silent except for the roar of the fire. The upload was stopped. In the sudden darkness, lit only by the flickering flames, Reacher drove his elbow into Cade's ribs, feeling them crack. He spun the man around, locked him in a chokehold, and squeezed. Cade struggled for a few moments, then went limp. Reacher dropped him and made for the door. The halon gas was beginning to hiss into the room. He held his breath and burst out into the hallway, just as federal agents, alerted by an anonymous tip from Sarah using a payphone in Silver Creek, swarmed the building. He didn't stick around. He didn't talk to the agents. He slipped through the chaos of the raid, found an emergency exit, and walked out into the cool morning air. He saw Sarah across the parking lot talking to an FBI agent, pointing back at the building. She was safe. The truth was out. His job was done. He walked down the long driveway of the Aegis facility, not looking back. He reached the main road and stuck out his thumb. A truck slowed down a few minutes later. "Where you headed?" the driver asked. "East," Reacher said, climbing in. "Just east." The truck pulled away, leaving Redwood Creek and its world of betrayal behind him. Reacher stared out at the passing landscape. He had no home, no destination, but he had his code. And in a world of lies and secrets, sometimes that was the only thing a man could count on. He stood alone, as always, but he had left justice in his wake. For Reacher, that was enough.